Thank you.
I will share my screen. So hello to everybody. Greetings from very springy Finland. It's really hot in here already. So I assume that you will now see my presentation.
Yes, we do.
All right. So as Raluka was summarizing there, I have been working on this project with almost the same name as this talk. So I will try to summarize main findings from almost 3 years of research. So it's a lot, but we also have plenty of time. So it's founded by the Konef Foundation, which is a private funder, and I'm working at Åbo Academy University. So here I focus on mystical type insights, but psychedelics of course can facilitate a wide range of insights besides mystical, but we will a bit touch on those other types of insights as well. So what is a mystical type insight? Now, William James had a really brief definition. He had only two defining features, and other features were not necessary for mystical experiences. So ineffability is one feature and noetic quality is the other for James. So we can say that mystical experience gives knowledge that is beyond words. Mystical experience gives the person some kind of ineffable knowledge. Then Walter Stace, something like 60 years later, gave more detailed definition of mystical experience. He focused on the concept of unity and knowledge of the ultimate nature of reality. Stace listed 7 features of the mystical. So in contrast to earlier definitions of the mystical, in Stace's definition, the positive quality is included in the definition. So this is something where scholars of mysticism have different opinions, because some mystic scholars hold that mystical experience is not essentially or inherently positive. It can also be really like scary and raise lots of anxiety provoking. But for Stace, the positive quality is part of that mystical experience. Sense of sacredness, positive emotion, and also noetic quality, as James also had, and paradoxicality and ineffability are also the same as James had. And unity is then for Stace this really most important defining aspect. So what kinds of psychedelic insights, and in specific mystical type insights, what kinds of insights do people get? So one clue is from the mystical experience questionnaire, which is based on the work of Walter Stace and Walter Panke, the religion scholar and psychiatrist. And this questionnaire is widely used in clinical trials and all kinds of research on psychedelics to measure the mystical experience. So there are items like these: experience of unity with the ultimate reality, or insight that all is one, living presence in all things, which is kind of like this vitalism or panpsychist metaphysical idea, or certainty of encounter with ultimate reality. So this ultimate reality reoccurs here, and I don't know how people who fill in this questionnaire who don't know anything about philosophy, how they interpret ultimate nature or like items like this. But the noetic quality is also emphasized here, that you are convinced now that you encountered the ultimate reality that is really real. And then we have insights that people themselves reported from both psychedelic and meditation experiences. So in this study we queried open reports of most meaningful psychedelic experiences and also meditation experiences. These are from the psychedelic group, but the meditation insights were really similar. So there were almost no differences between the two groups, meditation and psychedelics. Here are some of the participants' own words. We are all one. It is only our learned egoistic psyche that maintains the boundaries. Or we are all emanations of God, which is a bit like this God as the ground of being kind of idea, or a bit like Hindu metaphysics kind of idea. We are all beings made of love and light, fragments of God. And lots of these kind of quite classical mystical type insights. And it's worth noting that there were also lots of non-mystical insights and, in fact, psychological insights about one's own behaviors and emotions and history and so on. They were actually more prominent, more frequent than mystical type insights. But here we focus now on these mystical type insights. And then something about these long-term belief changes in our questionnaire study that was also yesterday mentioned by Raluca. We had items like this, which correlated with psychedelic use. These are idealistic and panpsychist ideas. All is forms of consciousness. Mental is more fundamental than the physical. Or love is the fundamental nature of reality, which is like a bit different from the others because it also has this positive valence in a metaphysical sense, that love, not any human kind of love, but some kind of metaphysical phenomenon is kind of love is part of the nature of reality. So these kinds of mystical type ideas, and why is this important? It appears that psychedelics appear to produce this mystical type transformation that also underlies the positive psychological effects. So on average, the depth of the mystical type experience predicts the well-being outcomes from psychedelic experiences in both non-clinical and clinical use. And also there is evidence that the use of psychedelics is associated with these mystical type beliefs like idealism. And also it's important to notice that in many cases, these well-being changes happen without any mystical features. So the mystical features are by no means prevalent in all psychedelic experience. They are only one class that have been studied quite a lot, but psychedelic experiences are much more than just mystical experiences. That's important point. But now we focus on the mystical. So now the question is, are the mystical type beliefs or insights true, or are they just comforting delusions? So here's from Chris Leatherby, the comforting delusions argument, which has gained lots of attention in psychedelic science. And I think this in itself is interesting because it shows how this whole discourse around psychedelics revolves around naturalism and science. Here's the first premise, is that naturalism is true. It means roughly that science is the accurate way to describe reality and that only the physical exists described by the science and physics. So it's kind of like framed, the whole discourse is framed around materialism and naturalism because that's the standard metaphysics currently in the West, in most philosophers. So the comforting delusion argument is quite simple. Basically, the point is that if naturalism is true, then there is no cosmic consciousness or no God, and everything is basically just dead matter, and consciousness emerges from dead matter, but the reality is not forms of consciousness or anything like that. If naturalism is true on the standard reading of naturalism. So on this reasoning, it would follow that this like epistemic status of psychedelic therapy, it is poor because naturalism contradicts these mystical ideas. So it follows that the epistemic status is poor, these beliefs are false if we assume that naturalism is true, according to Chris Leatherby. And this, according to him, is an argument against psychedelic therapy in general, that it's ethically problematic to do interventions that produce or facilitate in the participants irrational or false beliefs. So this is the idea. So many scholars have denied the first premise and also the second premise. Here I will focus mainly on the third premise and the first one. Let's start with the third one because to my knowledge there is not much discussion of this. Like most people accept premise 3, but I don't. Because naturalism can be given many kinds of interpretations. So let's focus on this premise. There is the implicit premise is that if naturalism is true, then mystical type insights or beliefs are false. Because if naturalism is true, then there is no God, no cosmic consciousness, and the reality is purely physical. So this is the claim, but I deny this. I say that this is not the case, because if we focus on the question of what is naturalism, then we get a much more nuanced picture of the whole thing. So this is from a previous paper that was published in Frontiers in Psychology in this theme number, Humanistic Psychedelic Science. So we can distinguish two components of naturalism, epistemological and ontological or metaphysical. So the epistemological component is that our ways of knowing reality should be compatible with science. And the ontological component is that everything is physical. This is quite a widely accepted definition of naturalism. So what does the epistemological component amount to? For example, Audi writes that acceptable methods of justification and explanation about nature are commensurable in some sense with those in science. So this entails that our ways of knowing reality should not contradict science, and it follows that we could have non-scientific knowledge of reality, but not unscientific. So, for example, I know what consciousness feels like, even though that knowledge is non-scientific and cannot be inferred from science. I know what it feels like to speak here about psychedelics and mystical experiences. I know that it feels like this. I know what the tea tastes like. I cannot describe it, but I know it. And this seems quite uncontroversial. But this knowledge of the feeling of speaking here, it's not scientific knowledge. But still I know that. So I think that it can be argued that this kind of non-scientific knowledge is compatible with naturalism. But then what would be a case of unscientific knowledge? It would be something that contradicts naturalism. Like, for example, one case might be telepathy, or that it's possible to communicate with the dead, because these ideas could be argued to contradict science, though, so that's why they would be unscientific. But non-scientific knowledge should be okay. So we can distinguish between scientistic naturalism, which holds that scientific knowledge is all knowledge, and then we can have real naturalism. This term comes from Galen-Strawson, who used this term, which entails that knowledge is wider than just scientific knowledge. So, and if we accept this premise that there are other kinds of knowledge than just scientific knowledge, then it follows that we can have possibly even these mystical types of knowledge. So this is the epistemological component, which I would argue makes mystical type knowledge possible, at least in some cases. So then what about the ontological component? Everything is physical according to physicalism, but what is the physical? Galen-Strawson argues that the physical is the ultimate natural kind term. It refers to the ontological class represented by, for example, the entities that physics describes and refers to. And ultimately, it can be argued that we don't know the nature of the physical because we only have our mental representations and models of the physical, like the models in physics, the equations and all. But we don't know what the reality in itself is like beyond those models that we have in our consciousness. And in terms of philosophy of language, it can be argued that, like all natural kind terms, also the word physical refers to a causal chain. It refers to that something that produces our observations of the physical, like that window there, that wall, that cat, everything. And all my conceptions and beliefs about the physical could be mistaken or inadequate, but still I would be referring to that something which produces my observations of the cat. So this is from philosophy of language and Kripke-Putnam externalistic semantics. One can elaborate this argument, but I won't do it here. But the case is that we might be mistaken. We never can know, at least a priori, the nature of the physical. We can study it more and more and more and go deeper, but we can never be sure that we have really captured the ultimate essence of the physical. And still all our models are just models in our mind. They are just mental representations which are distinct from the reality in itself. So this point can be illustrated with the case of consciousness. So if we endorse physicalism and we endorse the idea that this experience right now is a mental, it's a brain process, and if we assume that these two are identical, literally, that this experience is a brain process, and if we also think that this experience is experiential or mental phenomenon, then it follows that at least some physical entities are mental, which I think this is a really important point. Galen-Strawson argues that panpsychism follows from physicalism, basically on this line of thought. So we can formulate physicalism with a Kantian twist. And one way to illustrate or demonstrate this point is with the case of consciousness. If consciousness is physical, then the physical is more than what science or physics reveals. Because science cannot reveal that the tea tastes like anything or that there is subjective consciousness at all. If you think of Nagel's bats or Chalmers's zombies. So there are facts of nature which do not follow from science alone. Like, for example, what it's like to talk here. This is a really fundamental point. There are more facts than only scientific facts. And there's more to the physical than science reveals. And this can be elaborated in terms of Russellian physicalism, as Galen-Strawson or Philip Goff, they do that. And we, with my neuroscientist colleague Henry Raila, we formulated this into naturalistic monism, which holds that there is only one type of properties, those that science models, but science is limited to modeling reality, and it cannot have direct access to the reality in itself. So we have this kind of like veil of ignorance between us and the external reality. So the point I'm trying to convey here is that the physical is a mystery. Even through science, we get, of course, like better and better models of the reality, but what the reality is beyond the models is a mystery. We cannot know. That's a principled barrier for knowledge. As Arthur Eddington writes, he's a physicist, co-developer of the relativity theory. Science has nothing as to the intrinsic nature of the atom. The physical atom is, like everything else in physics, a schedule of pointer readings. The schedule is, we agree, attached to some unknown background. Some unknown background. And I would say that that's a mystery. Eddington thinks that we can argue that everything is consciousness. Eddington is an idealist or panpsychist. But I think that goes too far. I think we should just shut up and be silent about what the ultimate nature of reality is. But we will come back to that if we have time. So to demonstrate, I keep on like repeating this point because this is really important. Because many people think they know what the physical reality is. Many scientists, like physicists, are aware that they don't really know, but many philosophers who identify as materialists, or many lay people who identify as materialists, they think that they know what the physical is. They know, for example, oh, we have this helium atom. We know lots of that. Here's Schrödinger equation for the helium atom. I cannot read it. I just took it from ChatGPT, and an image of like illustration of the helium atom. But what is the helium atom in itself? So this whole model, it's in our mind. This whole model of the helium atom, everything that we can think about the helium atom, it's in our mind. And I think that there are really good arguments to the conclusion that the external reality still exists, that there is something that corresponds to the helium atom model. And well, argument for this is, for example, that the models of science are so successful in predicting the reality, and we can build nuclear power plants and everything. And this would be impossible if there was no some kind of correspondence between the model and the reality. But still the model, even the best model, and even if the model is true or correct, it still only corresponds with the reality, and it's still distinct from the reality in itself, which is, I would say, a complete, absolute mystery. And that's why it's a black box here. So this is the first conclusion, that mystical type insights can be compatible with naturalism. So because we have these black boxes, the physical in itself is just a black box beyond our models. So it could be mental, or it could be like God or anything. I will come in due course to other plausibility criteria for metaphysical theories. But because the physical in itself is a mystery, then it follows that it could be anything almost. It could be a God or something like that. That would require extra argumentation, but it can be done. So not all mystical type ideas are incompatible with physicalism. Physicalism is compatible with a form of idealism, I would argue, that everything that physics models are forms of mind. Okay, I have lots of conclusions and not so much time, but I will stop at after 45 minutes. So the first premise, we can also deny that. I think that we can accept that premise if we want to, but we don't need to accept the first premise, although most Western philosophers do accept that. So many authors, both philosophers and psychedelic scientists, and many people deny this first premise, but we may ask, on what grounds can we assume that naturalism is true? So this is partly from this article with this name, where I argue for metaphysical agnosticism, which holds that no metaphysical theory can be verified or proven to be true, or we cannot show either that some metaphysical theories would be false, at least in many cases, We can give some plausibility criteria for any metaphysical theory. Arguably, I would say that the theory must be internally logically consistent, so that there are no logical contradictions. If it's a conceptual construct, and if we assume classical logic, then there should be no contradictions. And second, the theory should be consistent with scientific knowledge of the reality. So it shouldn't contradict our established scientific knowledge. So the assumption is kind of scientific realism, where we assume that mature scientific models are true. So it follows that any theory of the reality must be consistent with this set of true propositions. But there are several theories that satisfy these two criteria: physicalism, panpsychism, idealism, cosmopsychism, at least certain forms of theism and dualism, atheism obviously, and so on and so on. But you know that for millennia, philosophers have debated like which metaphysical theory is true, and they haven't reached any conclusions. So I think this in itself is already a good argument to the conclusion that conclusion of metaphysical agnosticism. We don't know which metaphysical idea is true or not, if it satisfies these criteria. So that's the second conclusion. The truth of naturalism cannot be assumed. We cannot just assume that naturalism is true and that all other metaphysical isms are false. It just cannot be done. Like philosophers have been trying to do that for millennia, and it just doesn't work that way. So we cannot say that naturalism is true, we cannot say that idealism is true, or panpsychism is true. In my opinion, we cannot demonstrate any of these theses. So here's a side note. What is metaphysical in the first place? Well, it can be defined as an a priori thesis about the ultimate nature of reality, which is kind of like abstract and really general, like defined a bit in terms of metaphysics. So it already follows almost from this definition that it's not empirically falsifiable. But here it's important to notice, just as a side note, that psychedelics can facilitate also many other kinds of insights besides metaphysical insights. For example, paranormal insights, telepathy is possible, we can communicate with the dead, or all kinds of weird ideas, which can be epistemically problematic because they can contradict scientific knowledge. So now we start going into deep waters here. We never know whether a metaphysical thesis is true or not according to agnosticism, but still there was recently this paper by Adrian Kind, Faithful Response to the Comforting Delusions Objection, really good paper, I recommend it. A person can have faith in their metaphysical ideas, like personally, subjectively, they can have faith, but I would say that they can never know a mystical idea to be true. Faith and knowledge are two different things. And this leads to the hard problem of mysticism, which is the problem of like how could a psychedelic or mystical experience ever justify a mystical thesis? So how could a mystical experience reveal the nature of reality? That's the hard problem of mysticism. Because it appears that the mystical experience is in one's own personal mind or in one's brain when one is lying down, eyes closed, and having psychedelic trip or mystical experience. So how is it possible that the person would somehow know the ultimate nature of reality in this way? This is the hard problem. Because any kind of knowledge, if we claim that we have knowledge, then we must be able to justify that knowledge. Like I know that there is a cat sleeping on the couch, and I know it because I see it with my eyes, and you can come and verify it, and we can build a theory of perception that shows why this belief is true. But in the case of mystical knowledge, nobody has done this. So how could it be knowledge in that case? So to answer this question, so this is the last part of the presentation. about the hard problem of mysticism. When we speak about the fundamental nature of reality, we can mean two different things. First, maybe the more common sense, fundamental nature in the metaphysical sense. That means that's something from which everything emerges from or is based on or can be reduced to. For example, a naturalist might say that everything is fundamentally quantum fields and everything, like we macroscopic objects, cats and people, just emerge from this fundamental stuff or process. Or a theist might say that God is the ground of being, that everything emerges from God. But fundamentally everything is just some kind of empty consciousness or whatever, or quantum fields. So this would be the metaphysically fundamental nature of reality. But then there's the epistemic sense, which means simply the nature of an object in itself, independently of my sensations or thoughts or representations of it. For example, the fundamental nature of the cat, what is it? Only the cat knows. Because I only have my perception of the cat, my mental models of the cat, but when I leave this room and the cat stays here, I cannot know what the cat is like beyond my thoughts and perceptions of it. So that's the mystery. So to demonstrate even more or illustrate, in this epistemic sense, the fundamental nature is simply, for example, in the case of the atom, it's simply the atom in itself as it exists outside of my consciousness. Or in the early universe where there were no animals or humans to model the reality, there was no atom model, but still atoms existed. So what was it like? Like, what was the atom beyond our models of the atom? That's the fundamental nature in the epistemic sense. So it can be an atom, it can be a cat or guitar or anything, like independent entities, objects. But then there's the metaphysical, which is like the one single stuff where everything, the plurality of reality emerges from. Like some might say that it's some kind of energy, which was like condensed in a uniform form in the singularity in the Big Bang, and then it started to like spread into all various forms like us. So this is a picture from our paper with Henry. Uh, Here we have the whole idea is built on our perceptions and representations of reality, which are here on top. And then the reality in itself, as it is outside of my mind, here on the bottom, which is mostly black boxes because we don't know what they are. But here, the cat is here because this bottom row here is some individual person's consciousness. And if I, for example, I now look at the cat, so I now have this experience, cat experience. So I am myself one thing in itself or concrete phenomenon here on the bottom row. There's a sort of twist here because also these models of reality, scientific models and observations, they are also in someone's mind always. And if I, for example, I would be looking at the cat and a neuroscientist would be studying my brain at the same time, they would found this CMC cat activation, which means like constitutive mechanism of cat experience or constitutive mechanism of consciousness for the cat experience, or you could say like neural correlate of consciousness for the cat experience, with NCC cat, or whatever is the neural correlate of the cat experience. So it would be a model in the neuroscientist's mind. My mouse is not visible here, but in itself, That's something which the neuroscientist models as neural activation, that hidden object of the neuroscientist's observations and the object of his theories or her theories is my experience of the cat, or whoever is in the fMRI tube and doing all the experiments and so on, the object of the study. So this would require more explanation because it's a really fundamental point. But the idea is quite simple, that I have, through my own consciousness, I have access to a part of reality in itself because I know it through being it. I don't need to represent my being here in any way to know what it's like to be here because I know it all the time. This is it. This is what it feels like to speak here. I don't need to form any kind of metacognitive model or second order reflective consciousness to know what it's like to drink tea here and speak. I know it. This is it. Because I know it all the time. This is it. And I am part of the reality. So I know part of the reality directly through just ordinary everyday experience. I know this fundamental nature of reality in this epistemic sense because I know the nature of my consciousness in itself. If you disagree, I am glad to hear that and answer objections. So now we can say that this bottom row is the epistemically fundamental. That's the things in themselves beyond our models of them. And then we have the metaphysically fundamental on the left side, where the epistemic and metaphysic cross. So the golden grail is here. This really, really, really fundamental, both metaphysically and epistemically fundamental black box here. Like, what is it? What is the fundamental nature of reality where from everything like emerges from? Is it some kind of like quantum fields or subatomic particles, for example? Then the question is like, what is that energy or whatever in itself beyond our models of that? And this is the holy grail of the mystic. They want to know the ultimate nature of all of reality, and they also claim to know it. In any case, the third interconclusion is that one can know the epistemically fundamental nature of at least part of reality, like my own consciousness. This is it. And this can be amplified, or but one might become more conscious of this fact in a psychedelic or mystical experience. For example, just to see that, okay, this is like present moment awareness, also in meditation, when you are just like present in the moment without thinking anything, when you don't have any thoughts, but you are conscious, you know what consciousness is. It's this, when you don't think at all. And when you become more adept doing this in meditation, for example, then you can eventually like observe your own thoughts and ideas and also see that those are also forms of reality. And you can just see what they are in themselves. But okay, enough about that. But the point is that the mystic claims to know even more. The mystic doesn't only claim that they know their own consciousness, they claim to know the fundamental nature of all of reality. And that sounds, to my ears, quite chauvinistic or arrogant to claim that. Like it's a bit like one thinks that they are God, like omnipotent or omniscient, like all-knowing. So how could this be possible? One would be able to, one would need to be able to know this really fundamental. But given that our experience as humans, we are apes, like mammals, evolution has produced us here. We are really complex, and our experiences are like biologically and physically extremely complex processes. And even when we take psychedelics, those are really complex brain processes, which are based on neurons and organic molecules and atoms and subatomic particles, and so on. So how is it possible that when someone takes a psychedelic and has some kind of experience, we can presume that all kinds of human experiences are brain phenomena? Then it would follow that it's not possible to know, like, for example, the nature of subatomic particles through a human experience. Or the mystic would need to deny that experience is always a brain phenomenon. I think that we can argue that like consciousness can be something else than a brain phenomenon in some really wide sense. Like everything can be forms of consciousness, but it doesn't follow that I would have access to those other forms of consciousness. So we can say that atoms, for example, might be forms of consciousness, but our consciousness is still forms of like trillions of atoms interacting with each other in the brain. So how could we know the fundamental nature of these like more fundamental entities? So I will briefly go through some solution attempts to the hard problem of how could we know the nature of all of reality through a mystical experience. So this argument is from Walter Stace. He argues that he focuses on the notion of empty consciousness. He says that empty consciousness lacks form, and argues that if something lacks form or properties, then by Leibniz's law, it follows that that something cannot be distinguished from the rest of reality. We could elaborate this argument, but it's basically valid and like logical argument. But there is the problem that in the first premise, because if something seems to lack form or lack properties, it doesn't follow that it really lacks form or properties. Like, for example, an experience of empty consciousness, which is debated in the first place whether it's possible, but even if it were possible, then it could be argued that it's nevertheless a brain process. Even an experience of empty consciousness is a brain process. Like there are neural correlates for empty consciousness, and Metzinger has argued that it's a state of tonic alertness in the predictive coding framework, can be defined as this kind of process. But in any case, if empty consciousness is a brain process, then it has form because the neurons have form and they have properties, and the brain is distinct from the rest of reality. So it follows that the person who has the mystical experience of empty consciousness, they don't really dissolve into the fundamental nature of reality. They have a specific brain process. So we cannot really like reject this counter argument, and we cannot show that the mystical experience would reveal us the fundamental nature of reality. So here's the second solution attempt, which I like much more because it's more like a bit poetic. Like it can be argued that the reality is a single substance. Like Hinduists think that it's Brahman. Spinoza thinks that the substance is God, and everything that exists is forms of the substance. It's a bit like hylomorphism. So I am a form of the substance that is everything. So the universe is kind of like an ocean, and everything that exists is waves in that ocean. Like Spinoza speaks of modifications in the substance, like waves in the sea. And one could argue that we can see the substance through the forms in a mystical or unitary consciousness. I think this is like a fascinating idea, but it doesn't really rationally prove anything. It's quite speculative. Then as third class, I would have these like hybrid approaches that we can take the middle way and say that, okay, mystical experience doesn't reveal us the fundamental nature of all of reality, but it expands the shapes and forms that human consciousness can have, and thus it reveals more forms of the reality. Because I am a form of reality, and my psychedelic consciousness is a form of reality. And in psychedelic consciousness, I see completely novel forms of consciousness that is novel forms of reality, I get my glimpse into the fundamental nature of reality in this epistemic sense. It widens from this normal human consciousness towards like more exotic forms of consciousness, but they are still brain processes, essentially, at least from a naturalistic perspective, which I think is plausible perspective, to think that experiences, even psychedelic experiences, are brain processes. It seems quite clear that they are brain processes. We have lots of evidence for this premise. So we still get more knowledge only of the brain and not of the reality at large. But then we could make this pseudo rational continuum argument, the second point here, which is a bit different. We could simply hold that through my own consciousness, I get a glimpse into the fundamental nature of reality in the epistemic sense. I get to know this form of the reality in itself. And when I meditate and I just like focus on the consciousness in itself, I get to know this form of reality. And if we assume monism, or if we assume like the physical science's story of the reality, that this experience is a neural process and it can be reduced to the atoms and like the fundamental stuff that everything consists of, then it follows that everything is in continuum with this process here. It doesn't follow that everything is consciousness, but it follows that everything is of the same general kind of stuff. If there is this like smooth reduction in this smooth reduction from the human experience to all these lower level entities, if there is smooth reduction and no strong emergence at any point or no miracles at any point, then it follows that all of these black boxes must be somehow of the same general ontological stuff as experience. But that's only a pseudo-rational logic. It doesn't entail that the mystic would have some kind of direct access to the fundamental nature of reality at large. So the conclusion would be here. Do I have it here? Yes. The conclusion is that probably one cannot know the metaphysically fundamental nature of all of reality through a mystical experience. There is no plausible rational explanation how this could be possible. And this is the hard problem of mysticism. So, and before I stop, there is another fundamental problem, which is ineffability. So mystical type insight is essentially ineffable, non-conceptual. It is of completely different kind than ordinary knowledge. It is some kind of unitary knowledge, like Robert Foreman discusses, for example. It's something, well, if you think you become united with God or the fundamental nature of reality, you don't get any kind of like conceptual knowledge of the reality, because concepts are just like old models of the reality which are shaped through this ordinary experience. If you would hypothetically encounter God, you could not possibly fit God into our existing concepts, whatever they are. It would be something completely novel. So if something is non-conceptual, it cannot have truth conditions in the traditional analytic sense. So the whole question of whether mystical type insights are delusional or not, it becomes nonsensical, because we cannot evaluate the truth or falsity of these insights at all, because they are non-conceptual. So what we have been discussing here thus far has mainly been conceptualizations of mystical insights, which are not conceptual in themselves. So it would follow that all kinds of conceptual formulations of mystical insights are false, because they are distinct from the original ineffable non-conceptual insight. So this is a really fundamental problem. And it leads us to some kind of apophatic theology or apophatic metaphysics, where we don't say anything positive about the mystical, about the fundamental. We only say what it's not, like in apophatic theology. So, yes, we have human experience which can be expanded possibly through mystical experience, meditation, psychedelics, different kinds of techniques, near-death experiences can expand the sphere of consciousness. And human consciousness is one form of reality. We can say that it's the physical reality. And yeah, maybe not the best picture here, but then we have descriptions of the mystical insight, which is non-conceptual. God is the fundamental nature of reality or whatever. And this second conclusion, the truth of naturalism or physicalism or any other metaphysicalism cannot be shown to be true, which leads us to metaphysical agnosticism. And this also obviously includes the mystical type ideas that God is the fundamental nature of reality. We cannot show that that's either correct. People can have all kinds of beliefs and faiths, but it doesn't follow that it would be like literally true. And third, through a mystical experience, one can know the fundamental nature of their own consciousness. And as a matter of fact, it happens all the time. I know the fundamental nature of my own consciousness. Every moment it is this, at least when my mind is not somewhere away. But through a mystical experience, one probably cannot know the fundamental nature of whole of reality. And finally, if the insights are ineffable, then the whole discussion really doesn't make any sense. But the problem here is with the ineffability that, like many psychedelic scientists or philosophers, they still make extended theories of their mystical insights. They write books about their insights. They write articles about their insights. And people have this some kind of strive to or drive to conceptualize their ineffable ideas, even though ineffable ideas cannot be conceptualized, or maybe they can to some extent, but it's not the same as the original insight. Okay, I start now repeating myself, so I stop here and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you. So that you can also see everybody. I'm not. But it's blurred.
Yeah.
I will stop blurring it.
Oh, now it's
Oh,
blurred.
wait,
Oh.
everybody.
Hello. Nice to see you.
Great. So we have some questions from the room. They will come here and ask. Okay?
Yes.
You.
So thanks so much for that. This was highly insightful, if you'll pardon the pun. I was just wondering, you were considering the compatibility between mystical insights or mystical experiences and natural sciences. But there's a wide array of studies pertaining to the cognitive science and the psychology of mystical experiences. And part of this pertains to say what the structure of such an experience might be. So presumably, when you say that mystical insights are ineffable, part of that, and you say non-conceptual, right? It's going to be pretty tricky to say or to think or to ponder what exactly will have been learned or acquired or gained in such an insight, because you would have to put that into words or put that into concepts in order to sort of characterize it further. And so I was just wondering, sometimes in this aha experiences or eureka experiences literature, people tend to distinguish the surprise, the phenomenal contrast at play from the content that's thus gained, right? People want to be able to say, now I figured out the truth, and want to be able to spell that truth out, right? And so I'm just wondering if if you think that's a mystification of mystical experience, if you think that falsifies it, that somehow betrays what it is to have a mystical experience, or if you think mystical experience could be structured into, say, attitude and content, into surprise and the update or something of the kind, such that maybe we don't put it into words or concepts in the there and then, but retrospectively, it's afforded to us that we might gain some partial conceptual structuring of the mystical insights in question. So I realize that's a mouthful, but I was just wondering what you think about it. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, that's an important point, and it really appears that the person learns something, and there is the element of surprise, and the noetic quality is often like extremely strong, that the knowledge that the person gains is more real than the ordinary reality, but still they cannot put it into words, but they know for certain. Of course, one can give different kinds of explanations why that is the case. When you have like, well, people talk so much about the loosened priors as if it were like a scientific fact, which is it's not. It's just a theory. But if the priors are, their precision weighting is loosened and the bottom-up information flow is increased, there are plausible accounts of how this could lead to insight experiences in the predictive coding literature, like Ruben Laukkonen has argued for this, and McGovern also. But it doesn't follow that the insights would be true, because there is the psychological feeling of truth. And I think this is something that people really would need to understand, that especially lay persons, this is one of the risks of psychedelics, that even if something feels completely true, it doesn't follow that it is true. One would need to have some kind of evidence for the claim. This kind of like epistemic responsibility that Chris Letterby also speaks about. But about the learning, I do agree that people learn something in psychedelic experience. I did my first psychedelic trip, it was psilocybin mushrooms. I did it publicly because, and it was my first. I wanted to like destigmatize psychedelics, and there was a journalist there also, and I wrote a philosophical article like this, Mary on Acid. It's the name. It's in a book. I wrote it before I did the trip. It was like, you know, the Mary thought experiment, who has never seen colors, and then she goes to some kind of surgery and she sees colors for the first time, but she knew everything about the neuroscience of color vision and so on. So what does she learn through the first-hand own subjective experience when she sees the colors for the first time? I was thinking about this, like psychedelic naive scientist who has never taken a psychedelic. What does he or she learn when they take psychedelic for the first time? So I did empirical test on myself, like what do I learn? And basically, well, you can read it in the article, Mary on Acid, but it's basically this is it. It's the same I had prior to the psychedelic experience through meditation. That basically, like, this is it. You cannot say anything. It's like completely ineffable, because it's only, you can use the indexical word this to refer to it, but because it's a unitary knowledge, it's not conceptual. It's like it's knowing through being. So you absolutely cannot describe it. I still am of this opinion. So and still your question, like, what does the person learn? Well, at least they learn that there are many forms of human consciousness that they didn't know that exist. That's at least a possibility. They will know what it's like to have all the phenomenology of the psychedelic experience, but it's the same as like tasting coffee for the first time. They cannot still describe it to someone who hasn't already tasted it. And they can only describe it to someone who has already had the similar kind of experience, as it is with all kinds of sensations. So I don't really know. This is like really, really difficult. There are lots of hypotheses. Like, for example, yesterday we had this lecture about the epistemic virtues of psychedelics, and there was this mental opacity like opacity of the models, that one could see that all the models are just models. But I'm not so sure if this happens, because many people just become more confident of their models after psychedelic experience, and they fail to see that word is not the object. So I don't see, it feels like everybody learns different things, and the things that people learn, like if they resolve some kind of traumatic past things, like in these psychotherapeutic processes, there's so much things that are going on, and psychedelic experiences are always like different between individuals. I'm sorry, I'm not answering your question at all.
Well, thanks so much for the attempt. It's a difficult topic, and I'm very much hoping that you'll guide further study into it. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. We still have some questions from the room. It's okay.
Thanks for the presentation, and I will have lots of questions, but I'm just gonna resume into one. Could you please recap shortly one reason for why physicalism isn't true?
I don't think that physicalism isn't true, and I don't think that it is true. Uh, one can argue, like one can make lots of arguments for and against physicalism, and none of them prove or refute physicalism. Like all kinds of metaphysical isms, one can make really good arguments for idealism. I could do that, and I could also make really good arguments for physicalism. But one can also make equally good arguments against all those ideas. And throughout the history of philosophy, like idealists and materialists and dualists and monists and all different like proponents of isms, they have been fighting. And I don't really believe that physical disputes could ever be resolved, at least when the theories are prima facie plausible and they satisfy certain like basic criteria. So I wouldn't say that physicalism is false, and I wouldn't say that it's true either. They are just ways of thinking about the reality. That's agnosticism.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. One more. Werner, I guess we have two more questions from the room, and then you will put your question. Thank you.
Hi, Jussi. Thank you for the presentation. I'm gonna pack my argument down to something very tight. We'll see how it lands. And your argument was very thorough, and you kind of argued on not both, but all sides of the equation, including the agnosticism of all of it, and well, definition of what's true and real and all this. I'm gonna pick at the title itself, actually, going back to the very beginning of it, of comforting delusions, and make my statement as let's say perhaps incisive as this, that one can argue that non-mystics are not really qualified to make such statements.
What statements?
Whether this is a comforting delusion or not, because unless one actually joins them within that realm of experience, based on something that you touched on yourself, is that mystics claim or seem to know, believe, experience, etc., something more than us others. In a way, their point is not really anyway to convince us. I'm saying they, referring to mystics, yes, to convince us about something else, as much as really, if you want to check, come and see for yourself. That was actually one of the qualifications that the Buddha gave for Dharma. He was not trying to convince someone of some ultimate metaphysical reality. No isms, like come and check, have your own experience, and from within it you can check. So that's why I'm picking at the title, as in, back in the left brain, the master and his emissary, so to speak. The left brain is speaking at the isms and qualifying these things that it's not qualified to emit impressions on. Eventually, it can join in with the mystic, and then there's a different opportunity to look at these things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And yes, I agree, it's basically impossible to a large extent to discuss those kinds of like mystical type experience with someone who hasn't had any. It's a bit like discussing the taste of coffee with someone who hasn't tasted it ever, or like discussing the colors with a blind person. It might be interesting also, but it's impossible for the communication to succeed perfectly.
And
One problem, yeah,
more than
one
that, I
problem.
want to
Yeah,
blow a little bit
please.
the scale, because more than just the red and the taste of coffee and so on, we're talking in this case, we use such phrases as the ultimate nature of reality. So it's not whether you know red and I know blue and let's agree and it's something way more fundamental and essential. And it can seem presumptuous for one to say, I know more than you do about the essence of reality, which includes you and includes me. But I want to simplify a little bit with an illustration and say, in terms of senses, often these things are limitations in terms of our capacities, experiences, and even tools and models, like the Copernican model, right? It was fully rational, fully scientific, and all of that up to that in a certain way. And from the Copernican moment on, it was different. Then quantum, then whatever is to follow, right? What if the mystic is essentially proposing there is something, there is capacity, there are even models in a way, at least models for generating experience, not breaking the ineffability. All you need to do is come and access it from this standpoint of practice, and that's what many traditions propose. So then when a scientist or a rationalist or a logician or whatever ventures to comment on the, comforting delusions of it without having actually gone through the experience that the mystic is proposing to meditate, to take these other things and so on to verify, then there's something there that's not making sense. It's like not even using the scientific method to go in and verify scientifically if what this guy is saying is true by virtue of actual direct experience and even measurable in that sense.
Yeah, I sort of get your point, but then how can we ever know if two mystics have had the same kind of experience, or when they say the same words that they really have had the same kind of ineffable experience? And even if they would have the same kind of experience, they could both be just like mistaken in the same way. Like, for example, I have had lots of psychedelic experiences, and in some of them I have had like the profoundly absolute certainty that I have encountered the ultimate nature of reality or God or whatever. And it has been like so noetic that it's just like it cannot get any more noetic than that. But it's non-conceptual. And I'm like subjectively, I'm like completely 100% I believe it. But then afterwards, when the experience fades,
Right.
it usually retains its noetic quality, but I cannot formulate it in words. And when I think of it rationally, I need to conclude. I don't have any option but to conclude that I cannot show that this would really be an insight of the fundamental nature of reality, because my rational mind says that, okay, you took drugs, you had an exceptional state of experience,
Right.
so your brain was in a completely different kind of state than it was before, and of course it can produce those kind of like noetic mystical experiences. But when I think of it rationally, there is no way to show how this experience could really show the nature of reality. Given all the evidence that we have, it's still more plausible that it was just a brain state. You know, we have to reconcile
Yes,
this
yes.
rational thought and the ineffable knowledge, because we have all kinds of ineffable, like big insights, but it doesn't follow that they are true. Like, of course, I can believe, I can have faith in all kinds of like religious ideas or any kind of ideas personally on a subjective level, but I cannot say that I know it. For example, I can believe in God, but I cannot say that I know that God exists. That's just irrational, because no one cannot say that they know that God exists, because then they would need to have some kind of justification for that belief. It would need to be justified true belief, and no one can demonstrate that God, this God proposition would be justified true belief. So it doesn't
Yes.
matter how strongly I personally believe or someone else personally believes. It doesn't make any difference from a rational perspective, because one would need to somehow rationally argue for the conclusion.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Thank you. We still have one more question from the room.
Hi, thank you so much for the
Hey.
talk. This is just Just a comment. So I very much agree with everything you said. I do believe that those kind of experiences would count as ineffable, but maybe with regards to the question that some other participant asked, I'm not sure if you actually get to learn something. Maybe you get to a point where you suspend all of your beliefs, or you get into a case of suspending disbelief, right? So you don't get to learn something from, you don't get any kind of knowledge that, or you don't get any sort of knowing what it's like that you can generalize from afterwards, but you get a knowing how to let go of specific beliefs. And then what you make of it after having had the experience no longer has much to do with the experience itself. Maybe it has something to do with how with what you get from introspection, like what you remember from there. How are you going to use that ability to let go of some beliefs? Just a thought,
Yeah.
because the questions were like, what are you learning? Maybe it's the case that you're not learning something, you're just learning how to, you're letting go of some of the beliefs that you have.
Yeah, that's a really important point. I'm not satisfied with the answer to the first question, the first commentator there, but you basically gave the answers now, like what the person learns in psychedelics. Chris Letterby has lots of arguments about this, like, for example, the illusory or artificial nature of the self. Like I'm not just my self-conception, I'm something more. That's something that one can learn. One can learn that our models of reality are indeed only models of reality. Like yesterday, that one speaker was talking about the virtues, epistemic virtues. I think that's possible to learn with psychedelics, but many people don't learn it. Maybe it would require some kind of like preparation or intention. And one can learn that this way that we perceive the reality is only one among many ways to perceive the reality. It's only contingent. We have just happened to evolve in this way, and the reality in itself is not the same as how I perceive it, and it becomes quite vivid if my whole perception becomes changed. Then it shows how this is like kind of a simulation, this whole reality created by my brain. And one can become maybe more epistemically humble through psychedelics. And one can learn that the human consciousness is only one little slice of consciousness that there can exist, like all kinds of consciousnesses, like empty consciousness, which makes it more plausible to believe that the reality in itself is some kind of empty consciousness. I personally believe that the reality is just forms of consciousness, that everything is consciousness. I cannot prove it, it's just my personal belief. But I haven't learned it from psychedelics alone, and I don't think that it's knowledge that someone can learn it. That's different from the insights that people get from psychedelics. I think the learning any conclusions based on the insights is quite often irrational, and it's mainly based on the noetic quality, and people don't really like understand that from the premise that something feels true, it doesn't follow that it's true. That's just like yeah.
Right. So in this case, would this kind of experience get to count as epistemically transformative or just personally transformative?
Yeah, it can be both. And if one learns, for example, an alcoholic learns that they have used alcohol to escape their difficult emotions, then that's a really big thing to learn. But did the person learn it from psychedelics? It was enabled by the psychedelic experience. Some kind of psychological processes were opened up. But of course, like a psychedelic, it's just a molecule. It doesn't really like teach anything. It just facilitates certain psychological processes.
Thank you. I think Werner has a question online. If there are no other questions in the room. No questions. Okay, then Werner, go ahead. Thanks.
Thank you.
Jussi, thank you very much for the fascinating talk. I am very much like the idea of metaphysical agnosticism, and I think the same thing should be applied to any form of idealism. Academics is in a dire need of some humility. But my question pertains to the this is it kind of experience. I was wondering, what is your thoughts on the phenomenological corroboration of such a kind of experience? Because if it's only knowing through being, can we compare my knowing through being with your knowing through being? So if you look at how Metzinger explains this in his book from last year, The Elephant and the Blind, which is like a massive analysis on meditation, where he tries to compare phenomenological reports on meditation about particular kinds of forms of consciousness, and then uses this to formulate theories. So what question has two parts. One, is phenomenological corroboration really possible? And if not, how do we do the work? How do we do the work if we don't have access to any of the knowledge, so to speak? Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's really important questions. Phenomenological covariance, first of all, because it seems most concrete to take a grip on. There is indeed phenomenological covariance, or this kind of like shared features between mystical experiences. Like the simple example is from our own study, where we had these all kinds of metaphysical ideas, and they formed these kinds of like idealism and materialism factors, and the idealism factor was correlated with mystical psychedelic substance use. And then in this trip report study, where the people gave their own reports, many of them they all had these unitary aspects. Everything is one. So there is covariance, that people seem to get the same insights, at least to some part. There is lots of variance as well. It's like, but still there is some kind of like statistical pattern if you look at empirically. But of course, it doesn't follow that even if all people get the same phenomenology or same kind of insight from using psychedelics, it doesn't follow that the insight would still be veridical or true. You can imagine a drug that produces hallucinations of pink elephants in everybody, or whatever, take any kind of example you want to, but it doesn't follow that the pink elephants would be true and existing, even if everybody would get the same hallucination from the drug. But the shared phenomenology and this is it phenomenology. Do you want to elaborate a bit on that, Werner?
Sure. So if you think about, and this is where it becomes difficult, right? Because now you're asking me to elaborate on an inevitable thing.
Yeah.
But if you think of the this is it experience, there is a level of blatantly to it, a level of obviousness to it. Even though if that obviousness is inexpressible, the sensation of it is still the obviousness in it. So my question would be, if we have 1,000 people that have their version of a this is it experience, and we corroborate all of those reports, do we get a better idea of what it could be, with the acknowledgement, with the necessary humility that we cannot make truth claims. We cannot say that there's truth to this necessarily. We can just say that this is a shared experience. And if that is something we can then use to do more work.
Yeah, I believe that there are shared experiences and people have had these similar experiences. Especially when I read Zen literature, I feel acquaintance with what they are talking about. And it seems that they are talking about the same thing that I have personally had. So I believe in shared experiences, and I like Zen because it's negative. It emphasizes the distinctness between the words and objects, and also that the everyday mind is sort of like the enlightened mind, that you don't need anything special. It's like every moment, every waking life moment, you are in contact with the fundamental nature of reality. Like some Zen sayings, like what is Zen, brick and a stone or brick and a stick or whatever, like it's just like Zen is like this wristwatch or anything usual, when it's only that our concepts and this, like, we are so used to see things in this accustomed way. So when we meditate or take psychedelics or somehow just be present in the moment without any thought, then we can know like the reality for what it is in itself. And nobody can describe it, but everybody has had the same experience when you read the texts. But psychedelics is different from this Zen type of meditation because psychedelics have so much going on. So there's so much this, like, I would say also like distractions, which easily lead us to think that we have now learned something really important, but it might just be a distraction and it's not really the truth in that insight. I'm sorry, it's not
Thank you
really
very
good
much. No,
answer.
it makes sense to me. Thank you.
Thank
Still,
you.
we can continue our discussion because it's very, very interesting. Also at the round table and concluding remarks, maybe if you are still around, and it would be great.
I would love to be, but my kids are coming here, so I'm not sure. But let's see.
Okay, we'll see then. We thank you so much. Let's have another round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you. So now we are going to take a break for about 15 minutes, and we will get back at 4:45 with Maria Patricia Tinajero to continue the conference. See you soon.